Alice clutched her coat against the cold, her old hands shaking as her son Luke led her through the crowd at the train station. Luke walked forward without looking back, his face an unreadable line. Suddenly, Luca stopped and said, "Someone will come get you, I have to go now." Luke's words were contemptuous, hollow and distant. "But who? Why can't you stay?" Alice's voice trembled, her eyes widening as panic began to tighten around her chest. Without answering, he stepped back and walked away. Alice instinctively reached out, her hand almost grasping the sleeve of his coat, but he pulled away, avoiding her touch. She looked at his face, hoping for some sign of warmth, but his eyes remained cold. "Luke, please," she whispered, her voice choked.
"Don't leave me like this."
He didn't say another word, turning on his heel and running as fast as he could, his figure disappearing into the mist, leaving Alice standing there, her heart pounding with a mix of disbelief and fear. She couldn't believe that her beloved son would leave his 75-year-old mother, suffering from occasional memory loss, alone in this strange place. As she looked around, she felt lost. Her memories were slipping away, fading like the faint sounds of trains in the distance. Somewhere, deep in her mind, she remembered having a son, a boy with a sweet smile who used to hold her hand tightly as they crossed the street. But that image felt blurred now, as if the fog had reached inside her mind. Alice sank onto the bench, clutching her purse tightly, the only familiar thing she had left. She stared vacantly ahead, watching strangers pass by, each face a blur, each step a reminder of her isolation. "Excuse me, ma'am?" A gentle voice cut through her thoughts. She looked up, blinking against the foggy mist, and saw a young man with a concerned expression watching her. His name tag read Ethan. He was a station worker, wearing the familiar uniform with a bright orange vest, his face filled with a kindness she hadn't seen in years.
"Are you all right?
"Do you need help?" he asked cautiously, sensing her distress. Alice felt her throat tighten, words slipping away, caught somewhere in a fog of disorientation and hurt. She strained to remember where she was or why her son had left her there, insisting someone would come. Yet as she reached for the details, they slipped like sand through her fingers, leaving only hollow confusion. Ethan watched her closely, noting the flicker of fear and uncertainty in her gaze. Her expression was fractured, as if grasping for words that wouldn't form, a silent call for help she couldn't fully express. Sensing her need, he knelt down, his calm and steady presence grounding her, giving her a moment of quiet reassurance. A wave of relief mixed with embarrassment washed over Alice, but she managed a nod and rose to her feet, grasping Ethan's arm for balance. He guided her from the station, his kindness a shield against the biting cold. With every step, she felt a shade less alone, though an ache of emptiness gnawed quietly beneath her relief. Once outside, Ethan signaled a passing taxi, helping her into the back seat. He gave the driver his own address, a small, welcoming apartment where she could find warmth and rest. Back in Ethan's small apartment, Alice sank onto the sofa, her frail hands still clutching her purse as though it held every answer she was missing. Her face was pale, drained from the confusion and shock of being abandoned, and her gaze was fixed on some far-off point. Ethan, ever observant, sensed the weight of her fatigue. He moved with a gentle efficiency, warming up a bowl of soup he had on hand, offering it to her with a quiet word of encouragement. "Here, Alice, you need something warm," he said softly. She looked up, her expression blank for a moment, before her hands reached for the bowl. As she ate in silence, Ethan noticed her shoulders gradually relax, her breathing steadying. The simple comfort seemed to help ease her turmoil, if only slightly. As she finished, she fumbled with her purse, hands shaking slightly. She pulled out an old, creased piece of paper, almost unconsciously, and placed it on her lap. The sight of it caught Ethan's eye, a name, Nathan, scrawled in faint, shaky letters, along with an unfamiliar address. Curious, he gently inquired about the note, but her response was a blank stare. "Do you recognize this?" he asked, his tone careful, knowing the memory might be locked behind whatever haze had taken her past from her. Alice's fingers brushed over the name, her brows furrowing. "I don't remember him, but I feel like I should," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. The name, the address, it was a faint pulse of something forgotten but undeniably important. This paper was her only tether to whatever past she had lost. Ethan studied her face, sensing the urgency behind her confusion. Whoever this Nathan is, maybe he's part of your life, a friend, maybe family. Maybe he can help you remember. Alice nodded slowly, her eyes cast downward. She felt a pull toward this Nathan, a deep, unexplainable sense that this was someone who mattered. It was a spark of hope in a dark and fragmented world, and she was determined to follow it. The next morning, Ethan readied himself early, packing a small bag and grabbing his coat. Her gaze was steady but weary. She was nervous, perhaps even afraid, yet her resolve to find answers hadn't wavered.
Are you ready to go?
He asked, his tone gentle, offering her a small, reassuring smile. She nodded, clutching the note tightly, and together they left the apartment, stepping into the cool morning air. Alice's steps were hesitant, her heart heavy with the uncertainty of what lay ahead, but Ethan's quiet support gave her the strength she needed to move forward. The ride across town was marked by silence, Alice lost in thought, her mind circling around unformed questions and flashes of memories she couldn't fully grasp. Ethan sat beside her, occasionally casting a reassuring glance her way as they neared their destination, a nondescript building with worn-out bricks and a faded sign. It was a place that had seen better days, and yet it felt significant. Inside, the hallway was dim and musty, and they made their way to the apartment listed on the note. Alice felt her heart pounding, the anticipation and fear almost overwhelming. Ethan placed a steadying hand on her shoulder, silently reminding her that she wasn't alone in this. She took a deep breath, then lifted her hand to knock, each rap against the door echoing through the quiet hall. The man stepped back, opening the door wider as he nodded. Inside, the apartment was cramped, with mismatched furniture that had seen better days. The air was thick with the stale scent of cigarettes and coffee, and the blinds were pulled tight, allowing only slivers of light to cut through the gloom. He led them to the small living room and gestured to a worn couch. Alice and Ethan sat, glancing around, the weight of the moment settling heavily over them. "I'm here for Nathan," she said. The man, still standing, folded his arms, his gaze steady but softened. "I know, but Nathan isn't here anymore," he began, his voice careful, deliberate. "He left a few months back. Said it was for his own safety, and maybe yours too."
Alice's breath hitched.
The mention of Nathan's concern for her safety tugged at something deep within, fragments of long-buried memories beginning to surface. Her mind drifted back to images of her son as a young boy, his wide, trusting eyes looking up at her, and the sound of his small, carefree laughter filling their modest home. She remembered how he would grip her hand tightly on walks, as if afraid to let go, how he would snuggle up against her after a long day, whispering about his dreams and hopes. These images had clung to her all these years, even as everything else faded into shadows. The man's voice brought her back to the present. Nathan had often sat right by the window, always talking about finding her, about making sure she was safe. He had missed her, but he'd felt he had no choice but to leave. Whatever he'd been involved in wasn't safe for him to stay. The man went on to explain that Nathan had grown more and more cautious, watching his back constantly as if he were being followed or watched. He'd never given details, but it was clear he believed he was in real danger and needed to get away. In the end, he'd made his decision with a heavy heart, feeling it was the only way to protect her. The man seemed to read Alice's silent turmoil, and after a pause, he retrieved a small worn leather-bound book from a drawer by the wall. It was something Nathan had left behind with instructions, should Alice ever come looking for him. She took the book in her hands, the leather soft and familiar, as if it were a part of her own past she'd somehow forgotten. Opening it slowly, Alice's eyes traced over the handwriting, careful, slanted letters she recognized immediately as Nathan's. Page after page was filled with his thoughts, notes, and small, simple drawings. As she scanned through them, memories washed over her in waves. She remembered Nathan's intense gaze when he was little, how he'd often sit by her side, drawing, writing down things he'd seen or heard. He'd always been observant, curious. And now, here was a glimpse of that young boy in this book, captured in ink and paper, each page a piece of the son she'd lost. One note caught her eye, a short message written in the margins. "Mom, if you're reading this, know that I never stopped looking for you. I'll find you, no matter what." Alice's chest tightened, her emotions too tangled to unravel. Nathan had been searching for her all along, just as she'd been wandering, lost and confused, looking for a part of herself she didn't understand. And now, in this small, forgotten apartment, she felt a connection to him, as if he were reaching across the distance between them. She closed the book gently, holding it close as if it might slip away. Nathan hadn't abandoned her. He'd done what he thought was necessary to keep her safe. She had to believe he was still out there, waiting, needing her as much as she needed him. No matter the obstacles, she would find him. Alice and Ethan had barely returned from the address they had found when a strange text appeared on Alice's phone.
It was Luke.
He wanted her to meet him immediately, alone, and at a familiar diner she could vaguely recall from years ago. Ethan insisted on coming along, but Alice shook her head. She had a feeling this was something she needed to face herself. Inside the diner, the atmosphere felt tense. Luke was already waiting, his expression stern. The moment Alice sat down, he launched into a cold warning, telling her she needed to let go of her search for Nathan, that this was something she didn't want to dig into. His tone was a strange blend of threat and pleading, and it only deepened Alice's suspicions. She narrowed her eyes, unshaken by his attempts to intimidate her. She wanted answers, not evasion. Why, she demanded, was he so set on preventing her from remembering? Why was he trying to control what she could and couldn't know about her own past? Luke's facade cracked just a little, but enough for her to see the underlying panic. He looked around, almost as if checking if anyone else could hear, then leaned in, his voice tight with anger. You don't get it, Alice. If you keep looking for Nathan, it'll only end badly, for everyone. His words hung in the air, but Alice's mind was racing. This didn't add up. Who was he really, if not her son? She pushed him harder, sensing he was on the verge of revealing something big, something he'd been holding back since the beginning. Finally, Luke couldn't hold it in any longer. His expression shifted from forced calm to pure frustration. He exhaled sharply, then, with a tone heavy with resentment, admitted the truth. He wasn't her son. Never had been. Luke and his so-called family had been using her, taking advantage of her memory lapses and confusion. Alice suddenly remembered what happened at the train station. And Luke was her son who left her alone there. Alice felt the floor drop beneath her, as though everything she had believed was nothing but a carefully constructed lie. Her chest tightened, and she struggled to catch her breath as the full weight of his betrayal settled in. The man she thought was her son, the one she had cared for and trusted, was nothing more than a calculated fraudster. She had been their pawn, deceived and isolated, kept from her real family. Her trust, her love, all of it twisted and exploited. She wanted to yell, to demand why he'd done this, but her voice caught in her throat, paralyzed by disbelief. Luke's eyes hardened, and he sneered, almost relishing her shock. I told you to leave it alone. You keep going down this path, and it's only going to get worse for you. He seemed emboldened by her stunned silence, as though the confession of his deception had finally granted him power over her. But Alice wasn't finished. She fought through the shock, her determination slowly building back up. She would not be beaten down by him, not after everything he had done to her. Her voice, steady but fierce, broke the silence. I'll find Nathan, she said, each word filled with resolve. You can threaten me all you want, but I won't stop until I know the truth. Her declaration left Luke visibly rattled, his confidence faltering. He hadn't anticipated her strength, hadn't counted on her ability to rise above his lies and deceit. Alice didn't wait for a response. She stood up, leaving him there, fuming but powerless. There was no turning back now. She was going to find Nathan, to reclaim her life and identity. As she walked out of the diner, Alice knew that this was only the beginning. As soon as Ethan helped Alice connect with Nathan, she felt a flicker of hope, though doubt still lingered. It had been so many years since she'd seen him, she wondered if he even remembered her. But all that uncertainty vanished the second Nathan arrived. When he spotted her from across the room, a look of disbelief washed over his face. Alice hesitated, but then Nathan rushed forward, and the two embraced, clinging to each other as if to make up for all the lost time. Tears welled up in both their eyes, and she felt a warmth she hadn't experienced in years. In his arms, the fog lifted, and images, faded memories, began to resurface. She remembered her son, his laugh, the way he used to call her mom, as if the years of separation never existed. For the first time in so long, she felt like herself again. Sitting down, Nathan took a deep breath. "Mom," he said, his voice breaking slightly, "there's a lot you need to know." Alice's hands tightened on her lap, bracing herself. He looked her in the eye, his expression somber. "It all started when you began showing signs of memory loss." He explained that Luke, a man she believed was her son, had seen her condition as an opportunity. Luke and his gang had insinuated themselves into her life, pretending to be family, offering her a comforting presence just as her memory began to fail her. Nathan clenched his fists, his eyes dark with anger as he recalled the past. "They told you I was dead, didn't they? They made sure you didn't remember me." Alice's heart pounded as Nathan continued. Luke and his group began to take over her finances, making her believe they were family. They fed her stories, fake memories, so that any thought of Nathan faded, replaced by this fabricated life where Luke was her only family. Nathan had tried reaching her several times, but every attempt was thwarted. Luke's associates always found a way to keep him away. "There was one time," Nathan continued, "I almost got through to you. I tried to warn you, tried to show you the truth, but Luke, he was ready." Nathan's voice grew strained as he explained how Luke orchestrated a fake accident. It was a staged car crash, carefully planned. The impact was severe enough to leave Alice hospitalized, and she woke up with her memory wiped clean of anything that tied her to her real family, to Nathan. He ran a hand over his face, frustration clear. Alice's head spun. The betrayal cut deep, and the thought of Luke pretending to be her son, using her vulnerability to take control of her life, filled her with a rage she'd never felt before. She asked Nathan why he hadn't involved the police, why he had spent all those years searching alone.
Nathan shook his head.
"I wanted to, Mom. But without evidence, without you even knowing who I was." His voice trailed off. "They would have twisted it around, made me look like the criminal, like the one exploiting you. And worse, I was scared of what they might do to you if I pushed too hard." For a moment, silence hung between them, heavy with the weight of years of deception and pain. Alice felt the sharp sting of anger bubbling up again. "They made me think I was alone," she said, her voice trembling. "They made me forget my own son, just to line their pockets." She thought about all the things she'd missed, all the memories she'd lost because of their lies. Alice's mind raced as she pieced together what she could recall, bits and pieces of conversations, odd feelings of distrust she'd pushed aside.
"Now, it almade sense."
She remembered strange documents Luke had her sign, the way he always hovered when she handled her accounts, pretending to care while secretly siphoning her life away. She felt her anger harden into a new purpose. This wasn't just about reclaiming her life, it was about stopping them from doing the same to anyone else. She'd finally uncovered the truth about Luke, his lies, and the lengths he and his associates had gone to steal everything she had. Now, she had no choice but to act. The plan was simple but dangerous. Ethan would distract Luke while Nathan sneaked into his house and searched for evidence. They suspected Luke kept records of his schemes, receipts, transfers, or contracts hidden away somewhere that would expose his fraud. If they could get their hands on any of those, it would be enough to build a case. On a dark, windy night, Ethan drove Alice and Nathan close to Luke's property. They stopped a few streets away and went over the plan one last time. Nathan adjusted his jacket, took a deep breath, and slipped out of the car, his figure quickly swallowed by shadows.
Alice sat in the back seat, eyes fixed on the road.
Ethan pulled out his phone and dialed Luke's number, playing his part to perfection. As the phone rang, Ethan cleared his throat, preparing to keep Luke occupied for as long as it took. Inside Luke's house, Nathan moved carefully, the darkness pressing against him as he entered through an unlocked window. He made his way to the office, passing through hallways filled with silence. In the faint glow of his flashlight, he found a drawer stuffed with papers, folders marked financials, and notebooks that looked worn and crumpled. At the bottom, he found a black leather-bound book, a ledger. Nathan flipped it open and immediately, the names and numbers that filled each page jumped out at him. It was all there: Luke's dirty business transactions, payments made under the table, and financial records that could put him away for years. He snapped photos of the pages with his phone, his hands steady but his heart pounding. Meanwhile, Luke was getting suspicious. Ethan had been talking in circles, trying to buy time, but Luke's tone grew cold. "What exactly are you trying to tell me, Ethan?" Luke asked sharply. "I'm busy here." But Ethan held his ground, feigning an issue with his car and asking Luke for advice. Luke finally gave him a half-hearted answer and hung up.
In the house, Nathan sense time was running out.
He tucked the ledger back where he'd found it, erased any sign he'd been there, and slipped out the window just as Luke's car came around the corner. Ethan saw the headlights approaching and whispered, "He's coming back," as Nathan slid into the car, breathless but smiling grimly. They'd done it. They had the evidence. That night, back at Alice's, the three of them examined the photos on Nathan's phone. There was no doubt. Luke's ledger was full of damning evidence. They had more than enough to expose him, but as they celebrated, Alice's phone rang. The caller ID was blocked. She answered cautiously, only to hear Luke's voice, calm but deadly. "I know what you're up to, Alice," he said, each word deliberate. "This won't end well for you. Walk away, or you'll regret it." The threat was clear, and when she hung up, Alice's hands shook. She knew Luke wasn't bluffing. Ethan suggested taking the evidence to the police immediately. They all agreed that waiting would only put them in more danger. Early the next morning, Alice and Nathan took their evidence to the police station. They met with an officer who listened carefully, taking down their statement as he looked through the photos. He nodded, assured them the case would be taken seriously, and promised to contact them soon. On their way out, Alice felt a strange mixture of fear and triumph. She'd fought so hard to get to this point, but now she felt the reality of the risk she'd taken. They had finally brought Luke to the attention of the law. She hoped it would be enough, and as they left the station, she looked over at Nathan, feeling a deep pride and determination. The courtroom was hushed as Alice took her place at the witness stand. All eyes focused on her. For the first time in years, Alice felt the weight of her journey lift, if only slightly. The months of confusion, the betrayal by Luke, and the deceit that had held her hostage in her own life all came crashing down into this single moment. She glanced over at Luke and his crew, standing cuffed, all of them facing the justice she had fought so hard to bring down upon them. The judge nodded for Alice to begin, and she cleared her throat, steadying herself. She spoke with purpose, her voice unwavering as she recounted the details of her life, the things she could remember. "They told me I had no one left," she said, her voice echoing in the silent room. "They made me believe they were my only family. And I trusted them, I trusted Luke." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle, before continuing to describe the twisted memories, the manipulation, how Luke had preyed upon her vulnerability and isolation, stealing her trust. She told them how she had been deceived, slowly stripped of her autonomy, and made to believe she was alone in the world, just as he had intended. Alice could see the jury's faces change as she spoke. Their expressions reflected anger, disbelief, sorrow. They understood now. The prosecutor presented the evidence they had compiled, the falsified documents, the forged letters, the numerous transactions Luke and his associates had executed under Alice's name, siphoning funds and stripping her of property and assets. Luke sat impassively, his face a stone mask as the evidence was displayed, piece by piece. But when the prosecutor handed Alice a photograph to identify, one that showed Luke and another associate in her home, signing her name without her knowledge, she saw his composure crack. His eyes darted to the floor. The prosecutor seized on this moment, turning to the jury, calling their attention to Luke's reaction. Alice continued her testimony, describing in clear, direct words the day she had confronted Luke, her horror when she realized he wasn't her son. She shared her sense of abandonment and loss, her disbelief that someone she trusted would go to such lengths to manipulate and isolate her. Her voice cracked only once, a brief tremor when she spoke of her real son, Nathan, and how her memory loss had forced them apart, how she'd clung to any thread of family she could. Luke's defense attorneys shifted uncomfortably, knowing they had little to counter the raw truth of Alice's words. One by one, the pieces of evidence fell into place, forming an unbreakable chain linking Luke and his crew to a mountain of charges: fraud, conspiracy, theft. Alice finished her testimony, thanked the court, and stepped down, her heart pounding as she took her seat. She had laid her truth bare, the weight of her loss and betrayal exposed for all to see. Luke's attorney began his defense, but the attempt was weak, grasping at straws, pointing to Alice's lapses in memory and her age. But the jury, visibly unmoved, seemed to have already made up their minds. The judge turned to Luke and asked if he had anything to say. Luke hesitated. Then, in a low, bitter voice, he admitted to his crimes, though he stopped short of showing any remorse. He spoke coldly, admitting to the conspiracy, the manipulation, and even admitted to exploiting Alice's memory loss. His words were clipped and matter-of-fact, devoid of regret. The courtroom was silent as the judge read the verdict, sentencing Luke and his co-conspirators to lengthy prison terms. Alice watched as Luke was led away in handcuffs, his expression one of grim acceptance. There was no last look, no apology, no acknowledgement of the woman he'd wronged so deeply. He simply left the courtroom, his footsteps echoing down the hall. For Alice, it was a bittersweet victory. She had achieved justice, though it could never fully restore the years she'd lost. As she walked out of the courtroom, Nathan was there waiting, his face filled with pride and relief. She had found her son, her life, and now, she could finally rebuild. Alice smiled for the first time in a long while, feeling a sense of peace she hadn't known since the nightmare had begun. After the trial, Alice returned to life with a quiet resolve, the weight of past betrayals finally lifting from her shoulders. She had won justice, but now came the work of rebuilding a life that had nearly slipped through her fingers. She settled back into her modest home with Nathan, her real son, by her side. Each day was a fresh start, a chance to reclaim a sense of calm after the whirlwind of lies, manipulation, and loss. For the first time in a long while, she felt safe. Nathan, sensing his mother's fragility and determination, became her steadfast support. Every evening, he would pull out photo albums from the dusty old boxes she'd hidden away, each image stirring a piece of Alice's faded memory. He'd guide her through birthdays, family gatherings, and the smallest moments, like her laugh at a picnic or the way she used to bake bread on rainy days. Slowly, these memories painted over the empty spaces in her mind, reviving memories of love and warmth she thought she'd lost forever. It was like reconnecting with the person she'd once been. Then, there was Ethan, her loyal friend from the train station, who had appeared in her life in its darkest moment. His regular visits brought a steady, comforting presence. He never missed an opportunity to check in on her, often showing up with groceries or a hot meal, easing the burden of her new beginning. To him, Alice was not just an old woman in need of company, she was a dear friend who had endured the unthinkable and come out on the other side. With Ethan's support, she felt surrounded by a sense of family. No longer just Nathan, but a chosen circle of trust and care. As Alice grew stronger, she found herself drawn to her local community center. Here, among neighbors and familiar faces, she rediscovered small joys that she hadn't realized she'd missed. She signed up for a weekly crafting class, where she'd chat with the other women and laugh about things she'd forgotten to enjoy. She joined a book club that met on Wednesday mornings, poring over mystery novels and debating the twists and turns with friends who had once been strangers. Little by little, Alice began to heal in the company of others, her laughter returning with ease, her days filling with a simple kind of happiness that she hadn't felt in years. Life, now, was a collection of these ordinary moments. Sitting on her porch with Nathan as the sun set, sharing stories about his childhood that he'd never heard. Strolling through the park with Ethan, exchanging quiet words of gratitude, unspoken but understood. Alice learned to savor these moments, finding peace not in grand gestures but in the simple presence of those who cared. Alice's small house was bustling with soft laughter and the warmth of old friends and new family. Nathan had planned everything with Ethan's help, inviting neighbors and a few close friends for a quiet celebration, a fresh start for them all. Alice couldn't believe how her life had changed. Only months ago, she had been standing alone, lost and abandoned, with no memory of the life she'd once had. Now she was surrounded by love, not just from her son Nathan, whom she'd finally found again, but also from Ethan, the kind man who had helped her piece together her fractured past. As the evening wore on, Alice sat between Nathan and Ethan, holding a cup of tea, feeling the simple joy of belonging. For the first time in years, she felt safe, truly safe. She listened as Nathan shared memories of their past with their friends, moments she was starting to remember too. Ethan added his own stories, painting a picture of Alice's bravery and resilience that made her cheeks flush with a quiet pride. She looked at them both, feeling a gratitude that went beyond words. Alice's story, whispered from one guest to another, became a source of inspiration. Thanks for sticking with me to the end of this story. Alice's journey is powerful, isn't it? It reminds us of the importance of standing up for our loved ones, especially the elderly who may face vulnerability and isolation. Alice's fight to reclaim her life and find her real family isn't just a story of personal courage, it's a call to all of us to protect and cherish the older people in our lives. They're often our history, our roots, yet they can be the first to be overlooked. Imagine the strength it takes for someone in Alice's position to overcome betrayal, piece together lost memories, and ultimately find peace. This isn't just Alice's story, it's a reflection of what so many face in real life. Let's stay vigilant and compassionate. If this story has moved you, let's talk about it in the comments. Have you or someone you know had a similar experience? Share your thoughts or simply drop a word of support for anyone going through tough times. We're all here to listen and learn from each other.